It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webcast, Clarifying the Cloud, Streamlining Secure Government Operations. It's presented by Checkpoint and Swish Data. Today, we'll discuss a range of topics operations to dynamically deploy and securely operate infrastructure, platform, and software as a service capabilities, and a lot more. But before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping options for you guys. At the bottom of the platform, you'll find several icons, including a Q&A tab, which that allows you to ask a question. We'll be fielding your questions towards the end of the program, but please submit them along the way. If you experience any technical difficulties, just click on the help icon and a member of our support team will assist you. So now at the panel, joining us, we have Bill Hunt. He's the Chief Enterprise Architect in the Office of the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Small Business Administration, and Tom Johnson, who's Assistant Director for Information Technology Audits in the Office of Inspector General at the Government Accountability Office. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. We're going to dive right in. Most of our audience probably recognizes you both, but I just want to jump off with having you each briefly tell them a little bit about what you do and really highlight your vantage point or what your experience has been at the nexus of the federal government and the cloud. Bill, we'll start with you.
Great. Good morning, Brandy. Good to see you again. Tom, always nice to be on a panel with you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So my name is Bill Hunt, Chief Enterprise Architect over at U.S. Small Business Administration. For those of you who may remember me from these panels in the past, my previous life I was working for OMB, where I was the Federal Cloud Computing Strategy Lead, which we now call Cloud Smart these days. And did a variety of different policy pieces on data center cloud, et cetera, all the greatest hits. But wrapping that up, I was really interested in getting back to the real work. I spent 20 years in software engineering, so I was really interested in getting back to the agency sort of stuff. So US SBA is one of the leading agencies on cloud innovation, cloud security, had a really exciting portfolio of things to offer. So I was excited to come over here. Of course, a couple of months after I got here, we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're still undergoing today, and Congress tasked us with a lot of interesting additional work for us to give out small business loans for the disaster recovery. That's presented a wide variety of challenges, but thankfully the innovations that we've been making in cloud security and cloud innovation have really paid off. So excited to talk about that here today, and thank you for having me.
Of course. And Tom, what about you?
Sure. Thank you, Brandy. Thanks, Bill. So my kind of experience working with cloud in the federal space, before I came down to the Office of the Inspector General for GAO, I was actually on the IT and cybersecurity team at GAO itself, looking across government to see, implementation of various programs. People who've seen me in my previous life probably remember me more from on the audit trail than anywhere else. So, but the experience with cloud, at least my experience with cloud, has been interesting because I think cloud has certainly been around for quite a few years now, but where, you heard a few programs, a few agencies do, kind of dabbling in cloud stuff, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Now it's more unusual than out of the ordinary to see cloud on an engagement. It's kind of brought with it a whole host of issues. So from that standpoint, I think there's some really fascinating kind of opportunities, both from an oversight and from an agency perspective, as far as how they get the benefits out of cloud. Probably one bit of housekeeping on my side I should mention, as I am with the GAO Office of the Inspector General. I just want to point out that my comments here today are for myself. Shouldn't be construed as an official statement from the office, either the agency or the office itself. So.
Always good to get those out of the way at top. So now we're going to just dive in. Cloud infrastructure and policy is like a crisis. It's dynamic, it's ever-changing, it's always evolving. And due to time restraints, I'm going to make this really fast to set the stage. OMB in 2010 released the Cloud First policy. That was calling on all agencies to default to cloud-based solutions when secure, cost-effective options are available. And then in 2019, as you mentioned, Bill, OMB launched the next iteration of the strategy, Cloud Smart. You had a hand in that. Talk to us about the switch, Bill.
Sure. So obviously I can't talk too much about the sausage making process. What goes on behind closed doors at OMB stays behind closed doors at OMB. But I'll say this, coming in as somebody who was relatively new to government at the time, seeing the struggles that agencies were dealing with in moving to the cloud, some pretty obvious patterns became apparent really quickly. So I think the three key areas that came out of Cloud Smart around procurement, workforce, and security were probably the biggest barriers that we were encountering across the federal government. I would say that a lot of those still exist today in a variety of ways, even though Cloud Smart removed a lot of the low-hanging fruit, a lot of the barriers from a policy standpoint for agencies to adopt. One of the big impetuses around it was the data center consolidation initiative, where we were trying to get down to fewer and fewer data centers. FITARA was a big factor in that, but the federal government had been doing it for years before that. Ever since FDCCI, we had been getting rid of data centers. And these days, we're running low on data centers to close, to be quite frank. If you look at the current FITARA scorecard and the direction that things are heading, you can only squeeze so much blood from a stone. So the real big shift, I would say, that Cloud Smart kind of engages agencies in is really looking at your application portfolio and doing an application rationalization. Digging in and actually figuring out what do you have in the data centers. I like to talk about it in terms of instead of measuring your parking lots to get a smaller motor pool, why don't you look and see where the cars are actually going? So that's kind of the goal and the direction that I think OMB is trying to lead people in today. And here at SBA, we've really leaned hard into the application rationalization methodology using the playbook from the CIO Council and a variety of other tools to really get at that remaining fruit that you might need a ladder to get to that's not so low hanging.
That's great. And I'm going to come back to you in a little bit to talk about how that app rationalization and capabilities have paid off, especially now. But I want to go to you, Tom. What is your perspective on all this? Maybe in this light, is the cloud changing the hardware conversation about how agencies stay up to date?
Yeah, and I think to Bill's point about data center optimization, data center closures, I think one of the things that's also driving cloud a little bit here is just the legacy hardware that exists in the federal government. I mean, federal government's not unique in having legacy hardware and software, but I think cloud is something that agencies are looking to as a way of either getting their current legacy hardware upgraded, or maybe even getting off the treadmill entirely to take some of that kind of every 3, 4, 5 year discussion of how do we replace this box and turn it into an annualized cost. And you're actually having the same discussion around software. Taking that, are we still running Windows 2003? Well, if it's a virtual cloud system, then we have some options for getting off that and getting to the most latest greatest version. I don't know if more easily is the right word, but the barriers are different and may be seen as a little lower. And there's some challenges with that too. I mean, if your cloud provider decides that everybody's going to version X, you're going to version X, and if your custom piece of software doesn't support it, you've got a different set of problems on your hands. So in some ways, it's I think it's something agencies are looking at, or at least I've seen agencies looking at from a hardware upgrade perspective, and certainly just from trying to stay on the good side of the software out of date ledger.
Totally. Bill, you were nodding. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the conversation that needs to be had for agencies, is really figuring out what makes sense to move, what makes sense to stay. The government is what it is. We have a lot of older systems. SBA is effectively a bank at the end of the day. So, like most banks, we have a lot of really old, like COBOL code. We have a lot of, Fortran, Pascal, things like that laying around. I think we've gotten rid of most of that stuff, but we still have some legacy systems that cannot fail systems. They can't go down. And if you're building stuff on older, Spark hardware, things like that, it's going to be really hard because you can't virtualize that, right? There's not a modern, mature version to move to. So, when you're thinking about that portfolio and you're starting to rationalize through it, think about that total cost of ownership, including things like, can I reskill my workforce to be able to become SREs instead of data center practitioners? You have to do all of that math and put it together to say, is this a system that makes sense to move, or can we use the capabilities of the cloud to build on top and give us, more capacity, more availability, but leaving that underlying infrastructure on modern hardware, but not moving that part to the cloud. So there's a lot of different potential combinations of hybrid, multi-cloud, et cetera, that agencies are engaging in today.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me how it's with so many different kind of emerging technologies for each agency, it's a different experience, but all of you have learnings to share about it. This panel itself is supposed to be all about security, so let's dive a little bit into that. Tom, a question for you. How do agencies even begin to approach security? What does it really take to streamline security operations across multi-cloud and hybrid environments to operate the different as a service capabilities? And what are things that you've seen so far that have been successful?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny because security so frequently comes down to not the pieces of software you bought or the magic appliances you've installed, but it's a lot of it's about responsibility, understanding your responsibility versus the cloud responsibility. One of the things I've seen, I think Amazon and Azure, and not to call it any particular vendors, I happen to have seen their training on this. Amazon, if you take their cloud training, has a section on who's responsible for what. Here's the things Amazon does, here's the things we do, here's the things you're responsible for, and you have to make you have to find a way within your own security program of deciding if that's sufficient for you. From a cloud perspective, Amazon may provide you with third-party audits. They may provide you with the ability to see the results of their own controls testing, but it's going to be a different world because you're not going to be able to perform some of that yourself. Whereas in the past, if you had a third party that you were doing business with, you might be able to send some people to inspect their facilities to kind of get a sense for what they're doing. Amazon is pretty clear in most cases, I'll say, about you really don't have the ability to do that. You're going to have to accept their results or not accept their results and make yourself okay with that. From a success perspective, in my experience, I think agencies that do a good job with cloud security are the ones who kind of don't treat it as that different and also understand all the ins and outs of cloud security itself. I mean, Amazon, AWS, Azure, even the smaller providers, they'll let you set up a default whatever you want. You can, within less than an hour, have a completely running, scalable database cluster with web access, and it's going to be set completely to defaults. It's whatever they set up for you, and you need to go through and you need to actually do the work to decide what defaults are okay, what defaults aren't okay. Other things that agencies need to watch out for. It adds a whole nother network infrastructure on top of the existing network infrastructure you may be running, where if you're used to, you may be running a site-to-site VPN, for example, to add this capacity into your network, but Amazon has its own way of controlling access to the public internet from inside of its console services. If you're either aware of that or if you just click past the box that says, yeah, Amazon, you pick the settings for me, you could be opening a lot of ports to the world you didn't mean to, or even putting boxes on the internet that you didn't realize were even on the internet. So there's some duplication you have to deal with in a way, because there's another set of firewalls you're gonna have to learn how to manage. There's another set of networking appliances that you're gonna have to learn how to set up subnets on or not set up subnets on. You're gonna have to make some decisions there. That's really where agencies and organizations in general that's what they need to do to be successful, is to understand what all the little boxes and buttons are. Bill, I don't know if you have a
Yeah, I was making a bunch of notes over here really frantically because you've got so much good stuff there to unpack that, I'm just right on with. Over here in the executive branch, obviously, we have the benefit of FedRAMP, which kind of gives us a baseline of the security controls that are standard across government that NIST puts out, but that's like 2/3 of your security controls that they're evaluating and saying, are they doing the job? To your point, guards, gates, and guns, right? Like, everybody's got them. You can kind of assume that they're somewhat standard regardless of the vendor for the most part. With any luck, you're hoping. Those sorts of things you can kind of take for granted a little bit in government. But a lot of the government methodology, I feel like, coming from the private sector, is much more about like risk avoidance than risk acceptance. And I think that's been one of the dragging our heels sort of problems. Like, there's not a lot of incentive to be modernizing when you know that there's so much risk engaged, and we don't get any benefit for trying to mitigate risk, right? We just are hoping that we're being good stewards of taxpayer dollars and not necessarily going to get sued because we have screwed up or have a data breach, et cetera. So there's a much lower barrier of acceptance and tolerance of that risk. And balancing that is with the new technology can be extremely difficult. And then again, Tom, to your point, the skill set that's got to go along with that to even understand the implications of what you're trying to achieve. That's really hard when you've done things the old-fashioned way for so long. It's a really big paradigm shift. I think that, from where I was sitting before, one thing I've seen over and over again is that agencies that are really successful at that step are the ones that don't try to outsource all of that knowledge and talent. You really have to build that in-house so that you know what you're buying, so that you can read the SLAs and know what they mean. So you really have that understanding. And if you can use and reskill your existing workforce, they already understand how your systems work. They understand your data flows. Bringing that expertise to the table is critical. I don't want to call out any agencies in particular, but I've seen a couple of things in the news lately where people are just like, we're going to outsource everything that we do. We're going to get rid of all of our data center practitioners, all of our subject matter experts, and we're just going to buy a bunch of cloud services and some people to implement it. And that's not a recipe for success. You have to understand what you're building, what you're buying, because otherwise, Tom, to your point, you're not going to understand the nuances of those permission models and how it applies to government. You're not going to understand how your own data is flowing. And that is just really critical to making sure the whole place doesn't fall down, burn out, and sink into the swamp. So 100% on board with that.
And it's hard enough when I think the concepts are easily understandable. When you're talking about virtual private servers or you're talking about data stores, that stuff, I think from a traditional IT standpoint, is really easy to wrap your head around. Suddenly you're talking about Lambda, where you're implementing an individual snippet of code in the cloud and then trying to understand the security implications of that and how it's interacting with all the AWS, the S3 buckets on the back end. Or even, one of the things that continues to be the thing that surprises me is you can actually move your entire domain to the cloud now. You don't even have to have Active Directory infrastructure internal for the most part. You can push that all up to the cloud, and then you can manage it there. That's a whole separate thing to have to get your head around, because then you're dealing with not just the server infrastructure, but then you're dealing with the permissions to your entire corporate infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's a big thing to try and really get you to understand for it.
Yeah, and just to kind of take that a little bit further too, we've seen a big radical shift towards, as we were talking about before the conference here, the shift towards zero trust networking. This is indicative of where the entire private sector has been going for years. Moving away from this castle and moat sort of idea where you have to know every single permission, for every single user, and you set it in advance, and then you're just hope that no bad actors will get access to that data. And then be able to get into your systems, right? That's sort of a very old-fashioned way of looking at things these days. Being able to dynamically understand who your people are and dynamically permission them based on their credentials, whether that's, if you have a PIV card or not, or how they walk. These are all fundamental characteristics that you can use to determine a person's identity. We did some work in CloudSmart around the ICAM policy for identity credentialing management. NIST has been doing some great work around 863, especially in the Rev 3 that just came out a couple of years back. We've been seeing a lot of forward momentum in the government around the concept of identity, and that's really unlocking some of these capabilities that you're talking about with thinking about permissions and how we give access to the data. Because again, it's not necessarily just getting into the network we care about, it's protecting our data first. So you got to move your controls closer to that.
Thomas, yeah.
I mean, it's such a great point, because, as Bill points out, the larger private industry has really been moving towards a kind of a more of a zero trust model where everything is treated almost as a cloud server. From their standpoint, and I think the cloud has actually driven this in the private sector, where we may be accessing our servers entirely from our desktops to the cloud. There's not a management network to connect to that we can then have a VPN connection on the back end. So all of the interfaces are exposed to the internet. So we have to manage that whole infrastructure. That's frankly, I think, a little bit different than how government's used to thinking about their infrastructure. A really strong set of edge firewalls with some next gen stuff behind it, or maybe even in front of it, depending on which agency you work for, and then having, once you're inside, it's your Disney Fast Pass to whatever ride you want to be on. And that's, I think that you are going to have to see some of that potentially change as you move to the cloud, because especially as you have a hybrid model where you have some data center resources, There's still some cloud resources. Both have to be managed. Maybe there has to be live data transfer between the two, even where it's not that they're just two separate silos. It's really one system working across both environments. It's how you do security and how you think about permissions. Again, you may not have to change, but you should at least consider how you're doing it. I think that's kind of the, to Bill's point about risk mitigation. It's all about decision making, right? And the way you make decisions is by having the information in front of you.
Right. Yeah, and a good point that you guys are kind of both raising with this idea of risk avoidance versus risk acceptance. To me, that also kind of sounds like big picture about like an agency's culture and how much they welcome this. So from your perspectives, what is an agency's, describe a culture that is like sort of ready for the cloud or ready to kind of deploy this stuff effectively? Bill, we can start with you.
Sure. I think there are a lot of components that go into it. One is just a top cover level willingness to actually try new things. And part of that is giving your teams the permission to be able to understand that they're going to fail. In government, that is a terrifying thing. That this service that you're about to stand up, that you're about to spend millions of taxpayer dollars on, might not work exactly how you think it's going to. I feel like it goes without saying, agencies that are more agile are better at this, because rather than making a $10 million mistake, you can make a couple of, $50,000 mistakes, and you haven't lost the whole system. So doing it in smaller chunks, iterative improvement, that's really critical as well to really making sure that you make that successful transition and how you're thinking about risk and avoiding it. And then at the low levels, as I was talking about before, you have to have the rank and file staff really bought in. They have to be willing to adapt and change. For a lot of traditional teams, it's a major, major overhaul to go from sort of this is my silo, that is your silo. We are compliance-based security. Make sure you check the box before you come back to me. That's totally different from a modern DevSecOps model, where it's creating and improving and changing. For federal executive branch agencies, that means rethinking how you approach FISMA with regard to like your ATO process. Instead of doing a third of your security controls every 3 years, doing continuous authorization and using your monitoring tools to say that you are secure, rather than a paperwork exercise that may stop bullets, but doesn't actually give you any actual indication of your security. So that's sort of that cultural mindset shift that has to happen. And it's all around, trust, resilience, and agility, and really building that knowledge base in your organization.
That's great. And Tom, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think Bill makes some great points. It's moving towards that risk mindset and less towards the compliance mindset. It's, we talked about risk acceptance, risk avoidance, but it's about how an organization discusses risk internally. Is risk something that you don't want to hear about, or is risk something that you hear about so that you can address it, right? And how does your organization look at risk? Is risk something to be managed, or is risk something to be minimized, right? And because when you start dealing with these cloud type implementations, to Bill's point about when you start making agile organizations who can make smaller mistakes along the way, there's a temptation to kind of to swing for the fences potentially on some of these projects, to do the big cloud project as opposed to maybe doing like 20 smaller cloud projects to get the organization where it needs to be, because cloud implementations will start to expose some of those gears that don't quite fit right in your organization. And Bill, even between work teams, but it goes into the to the admin and operations side as well. I mean, how is your organization prepared to deal with kind of on-demand procurement? If you need the ability to spin up a server in 30 seconds is great, but if it takes you 6 months to spin up a server in 30 seconds, maybe there's some work to do on the back end. But maybe your agency has a need for that. Maybe that process has a basis in law, in controls, and understanding that if whatever delays are there because they need to be there, versus it could potentially be eliminated through process improvements. I think those are the kind of things that you look at cloud ready organizations. I think that the flexible and adaptable is a key there, because you're going to find things that you didn't realize you had to do differently.
If I could expand on one thing that Tom brought up there too, that kind of stands out to me, I'll also say that there's a flip side to being like agile, and that is you still do need some sort of like clear vision and direction and goal. Like we were talking about like the projects and all the spindly little ones and just trying to move everything to cloud. The federal government has a real problem with the fact that it hasn't modernized, and therefore it goes what I like to call shiny chasing a whole lot. You'll hear a conversation 100 times a day about like, oh, well, the hearing we just had this week. Why aren't you moving everything to blockchain? Well, a lot of really good reasons. Number one, you don't need it if you have a database in 99.999% of cases. But the government latches on to these buzzwords, your RPAs, your, whatever you have, AI, machine learning, all of these concepts that, again, the private sector has had for years. And if you just go into a mindset of, here's a solution, and I really would love to find a problem that we could solve with it so we can get in the press. If you make that sort of an approach in these modernization efforts, like you're just going to fail. You are going to just burn through taxpayer dollars and waste it. Your projects are not going to succeed because, again, you're just running faster than you can walk. So making sure that you start from like a problem standpoint. And again, as like a very cynical security engineer and software engineer, like I always say, like find the dumbest possible solution that will solve your problem for you and work from there and iterate up rather than, starting with these highfalutin expensive buys and, just because you want to put it on your resume.
I think Bill's point there is excellent, especially because when it comes to cloud, the cloud isn't the point. Cloud is the tool you use to get the thing you want. So when it comes to why do you use the cloud, it's the same as why do you use anything? Is there a cost advantage to using the cloud? Is there a potential future cost savings to using the cloud? And it's not, is there a cost savings necessarily versus today versus using the cloud tomorrow? It's what are the other options, not even using the cloud? Is this a better solution for on-prem for any number of reasons? Is it, I think Bill's point about the strategy and vision is well taken. Is cloud a thing you want to do? Or are you going to do this one project in cloud, decide that it wasn't really for you, but still have to support it till the end of time?
Can I nitpick one little thing there?
Yeah.
Having spent a lot of time working with the cloud, I think we need to get rid of this notion of cloud savings and avoidance. We really have to get past that. If you actually do a TCO and you start looking at like pulling apart your training and things like that, it's going to take a really long time for a federal agency to be able to make a shift to where they're going to see cost savings from cloud. That goes against all common guidance that we've heard over the last 10 years, but just looking at the receipts at the end of the day, it's going to be really hard for an agency to make that shift. In cloud, you're building servers and burning them down and replacing them. That hardware refresh cycle happens behind the scenes and you're not doing it. But the thing that you lose is if you run your own data center, you can run your machines into the red and not do your standard refresh cycles and keep pushing and pushing and pushing and running the same code forever. Cloud doesn't give you that option. You're still paying the same bills. Any data you put in there, you're paying 4 or 5 times over, right? You've got storage, compute, ingress, egress, and any backup you do. So those sorts of things really have to go into the TCO that Tom was talking about and really thinking about it. That being said, the brilliance of cloud is the things that also you mentioned earlier. You get the security controls for free. You don't have to think about those things. It comes in the box. You get all of these new capabilities. You get the, like you were talking about, like you can spin up a server instantly. You don't have to go through a 6-month procurement to wait for your hardware to come in. Especially during a global pandemic emergency where nothing is shipping very quickly and people aren't manufacturing at the normal rates. So all of those capabilities get unlocked. And I really like to talk about IT modernization from, as Tom was saying, capability building. And if you get cost savings 10 or 15 years down the road, that's great. But again, we can't use that as the end goal until the end of time. The government is only doing more work in computing. Like that's not going to stop. We're not going to do less compute. So the notion that we can shrink IT budgets is ridiculous. If you are a congressman listening in on this conversation, I highly recommend you get out a spreadsheet, do some math here and take a look at it. Because again, it's not about the cost savings. It's really about unlocking the capabilities to deliver services that the American people want and need.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the TCO point is an excellent one because, I mean, frequently the TCO estimates are kind of, it's a kind way of putting this, not complete. But by this, I think by the same token, when you look at, it's maybe not necessarily about lowering budgets as it is about bending the curve of budgets to slow growth, to be able to absorb more capacity in the future, to be able to do, as Bill said, to be able to do more work with not as many resources that you maybe would have needed in the future. Buying hardware internally can be kind of spiky in capacity. You buy a server because you needed 1 more of something. It can support 100 more of something. Eventually you'll get to 80, 90% utilization maybe. But until you get there, that that return on investment is a different perspective versus I needed X, I got exactly X I needed today. If I need X plus 1 tomorrow, I'll get X plus 1 tomorrow.
100%, totally agree.
That's great. Just one or two more questions before we go to the audience, reminding the audience to submit your questions as you have them. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Bill, because especially as an emerging tech focused reporter, I'm really interested in this. COVID-19, we can't escape the reality. A lot of agencies have pointed to using cloud capabilities to help with their response. How has SBA changed how you do business as a result of the pandemic? How has cloud security played into that? And can you go back to what you mentioned about the impact of app rationalization on that?
Sure, absolutely. So again, as I mentioned before, SBA was really forward-leaning on cloud as an agency. We are the biggest little cabinet level agency at the end of the day. We have about a staff of 2,000 to 3,000 on normal times, but during an emergency, we scale up rapidly. So over the course of a couple of weeks, we hired somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 detailees, temp hires, contractors, et cetera, to support all of these efforts around granting grants and loans. That's a major challenge for an agency under normal circumstances. But you add a pandemic where everybody is teleworking and you can't necessarily go to the security office to get your PIV card, and that just complicates things even more. So thankfully, since we had already really heavily invested in cloud, we were able to develop and deploy a lot of capabilities we had already been working on that we already had in place so that staff could be up and running immediately. I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. Obviously, we had already moved to using all of our desktop software in the cloud, basically at this point. Everybody knows who I'm talking about, don't have to name out vendors. But moving into that direction and really getting ahead of the curve on that really, really helped us because, wherever you are, you have connectivity. Part of that means that for staff, we can enable things like multi-factor access. If your PIV card is locked out, to be able to give you access to those sorts of services, know that you're still connecting securely, again, going back to the zero trust model based on what you have, and still be able to access things. So another piece of that means that if we have contractors coming in, or if somebody from another agency is a better example, if they already have a government issued laptop and they have a government issued PIV card and that works for them today, and they're just working for SBA for a few weeks, we don't need to give them another laptop and another PIV card. That doesn't make sense. What makes more sense is we can give them a virtual desktop in the cloud. And this goes back to something that Tom was talking about earlier. Just instantly, that means that you are completely cloud enabled. You have access to all of our other cloud related services. You're treated as if you're an on-premise person sitting inside of an SBA building. But you're able to access and be a call center employee or a loan officer, whatever you need to be that day. We can issue a virtual desktop and make you into that person without having to necessarily be in the building, but still knowing that you're going to have a secure connection and that you have the credentials to know that you are who you say you are. Part of that means that, when you're doing the rationalization of your portfolio, to your previous question, you actually look and say, what are the actual needs of our users? I'm really excited that OMB has put such a focus on customer experience lately. Seeing CX, come out in A11, Section 280 has been fantastic because it really doubles down on, are the things you're doing serving your customers, whether those are internal or external, and really starting to think about what are your needs as an organization. Not everybody is going to have the needs to scale up at that rate that SBA does, hopefully in a normal circumstance. Not everybody has that sort of emergency response capability. But if you think about your users in terms of remote first, and this is something I did in the private sector, if you treat everybody as if they're working remotely first as a primary concept, that really serves a customer experience where they can work wherever they are if there is an emergency or if there isn't. Having good documentation, having access to cloud services, and knowing that that security layer is always going to be there regardless of where you are, instead of, again, the castle and moat, that unlocks those capabilities and really makes for success.
Awesome. It's great to hear you guys are having those learnings too. I didn't think I would be considering a remote first reality until the last few months hit, so very helpful. We have a few questions from our audience. Here's the first. What expectations are there for agencies to monitor security controls that are the responsibility of the cloud provider? Frequency? Question mark.
That's a good question. Tom,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. But you first.
Well, obviously my standpoint comes from, again, executive branch. We have certain, FISMA requirements. We have certain security requirements we have to fulfill. I think if you're talking about a cloud technology, again, by regulation, by policy, you have to go to FedRAMP first and see, is it in there? Make sure that like we're using FedRAMP-based technologies because FedRAMP does all of that security stuff for you. And they determine and can tell you, is this your responsibility or does the cloud provider provide that layer of that piece of security? Obviously, you know, I'm not NIST and I am not GSA, so I'm not going to tell you exactly which controls those are for your agency and what you have to go through and look at. But again, I think it is all mostly well documented for at least our federal requirements for the executive branch. It's pretty easy to determine who is on which side of the fence with regard to responsibilities. The only thing I'll add to that is don't get squirrely with your SLAs. Don't think that you need to customize those every single time something comes up. Number one, the FAR says you can't by law. So don't do it. But also, you don't really need to. GSA worked really closely with most of the major cloud vendors to make sure that we have standard SLAs that really make it clear who needs to deal with what side of things. At the end of the day, as long as you can see what's going on, as long as you have good access to your logs, you'll be pretty safe and you can probably incorporate your existing security appliances with whatever you're doing. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think what I would add to that is it really, I think some of it comes down to what is your agency's, what is your organization's CDM program say? And this is part of the decision process that involves cloud, which is if your CDM program says that we are going to monitor physical security controls every month for some reason, and the whatever cloud provider you've chosen only updates their SOC 1, SOC 2s, SAE, whatever they're using. If they only update that every year, you have some decisions to make internally about what's the can you actually meet your own CDM requirements? Can you actually meet your own continuous monitoring requirements? The same thing with which controls need to be monitored. It's going to come down to what does your security program say at a very high level as far as which ones. FedRAMP, I think FedRAMP helps you with some of that guidance. Some agencies are going to have different requirements for that, though. I mean, ultimately, you do have that ability to kind of tighten down on what FedRAMP says, and if what FedRAMP says is, if it says 6 times and you need it 12 times, well, that again, those are those risk-based decisions you need to be making, and I think that's kind of how you need to think about the cloud controls. I've certainly seen organizations at any point who deal with the cloud will have the experience of, oh, they say they're doing this, but we really would like them to do this. Well, we can't tell them what to do, so we've got to change our requirements. Sometimes, and I think Bill's point, I think it's a similar conversation with SLAs. SLAs, you can't modify them. Sometimes these security controls, no matter how much you want these massive, multi-billion-dollar corporations to do it slightly differently, they're gonna be like, nah, we're good. Maybe there's a smaller provider who can help you meet your needs a little better. And that may be the right decision for your organization, or maybe you need to look at those and say, we defined our organizational acceptance for this control 30 years ago. Maybe it's time to revisit that. So, I mean, as far as the expectation, the reason I brought it up earlier, as far as who's responsible for what, ultimately the agency is responsible for its security program. How you go about making yourself comfortable with third-party providers has been an issue since well before cloud. And it's going to, I think cloud is, again, to kind of what I was saying, it's going to exacerbate some of those issues because you're going to be hitting that stone wall of here's what we do, take it or leave it a little bit more.
Yeah, and you guys, oh yeah, sure.
No, sorry. I mean, again, Tom, so much stuff there to unpack. I strongly agree. I think that one thing that agencies can do, and you kind of alluded to, is prioritize what security controls are valuable to you as an organization. Your tolerance for risk is not just going to be like, is it FISMA high, medium, or low, right? It's a question of what are the things that we are really most concerned about? What's the sort of data we're doing? What's our mission look like? What do we have to protect and how do we really want to protect it? And to that end, I think that agencies have the freedom to be a little bit more cynical about the providers they choose and why they choose them. There have been a lot of interesting news stories over the last couple of years where you've got major vendors saying things like, don't ask us how our AI works. We don't have to tell you. It's a trade secret. And what we do with that data is fine. If we want to store that, metadata in North Korea or Iran, that's our business. So don't ask us because we're smarter than you. And quite frankly, that is not really great for an organization. Even if it's a multi-trillion-dollar company that you were doing business with, just because they think that they're smarter than you is not a good reason to trust them. So you do have to be pragmatic about what your vendor's choice is, again, to Tom's point, which is very accurate and painfully clear in the world that we live in. Maybe you choose a smaller provider because you can see everything that they're doing inside out, and because you have that extra layer because that's what's important to you. So Tom, 100%, 100%.
And I guess one thing I'll even piggyback on that, which is, I think there's a lot of I think I've been doing a bit today. We're kind of verbally slipping into the big private providers. Whether the very, very large companies. There are government agencies doing cloud services to other government agencies. So everything all of these security control issues still apply there. It's just it may look differently. So again, FedRAMP. I would have to go back and look and see if any agencies have FedRAMP their own services, but there are certainly FISMA-like controls over those services, and you may have more luck with another government agency than a private provider, or vice versa, depending on your situation.
Yeah, I mean, I can't get into too many specific details to that end, but a lot of, say, the CDM related stuff that DHS puts out, et cetera, they put out open calls for agencies that want to do pilots using CDM-like capabilities without necessarily using the same tooling. And we were one of the pilot groups for that. It was wildly successful for us, being able to have tooling that we could use, whether it's in our data center, our desktop, or our cloud, and be able to have that same viewpoint. Those are capabilities that we couldn't get out of the systems that they were putting in front of us at that time. So definitely, being pragmatic, being cynical, and again, to your point originally, Tom, does it solve the problem that you have? That's the real question at the end of the day.
Yeah. We're getting so many good questions. Thank you to our audience. Another one is about SLAs, which you guys both mentioned. Are your SLAs providing 100% single tenancy environments? How do you vet security against availability and cost?
Yeah, so I guess I would start with that. I think it depends on your definition of single tenancy. Because I think the private sector tends to view the government as a tenant, and they don't maybe necessarily fully appreciate all of the differences between the agencies, and they're like, well, government is government. We put you in the government cloud. So if you're thinking single tenancy as, is this the gov cloud for whatever service? I think there are certainly some examples of that. And I think the SLA question gets into, you may not have that much ability to modify the SLAs. So I think you have to be careful about what you're buying and understanding what's being purchased. Again, if you need like single tenancy for your agency or for your organization, then you're getting into, I think, a little more. Bill, feel free. I think you're getting a little more boutique arrangements for that, because then you're looking at kind of like single stack cloud-like environments.
Yeah, I mean, I would just camp onto that and say, again, it goes back to the question of your risk acceptance and your tolerance, right? There's no reason that a federal agency can't use public cloud. That's totally available. That's totally an option. If you've got an encrypted virtual machine there, is that really that big of a deal and something that you should spend your time on? Well, that's up to you. On the other end of the paranoia spectrum, if you have things that you wouldn't trust a cloud vendor with in the first place, you can go and build your own cloud. I mean, cloud is just somebody else's data center. There's nothing stopping you from repurposing the many, many existing data centers in the federal government, running cloud in it, having your hypervisor sitting there doing whatever you want them to do. That's totally an option on the table. So I would say, again, with the SLAs and talking about 100% single tenancy environments, again, it's you got to read the fine print on the label. Depends on the vendor, and you may not need it anyway.
Yep.
And the last part of that, vetting security against availability and cost, as a federal lifelong NIST reader, NIST would, I think, certainly say that availability is a part of the security calculation, as far as when it comes to, are you looking at confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then how that plays into cost. I think that's all part of that. That's all part of how you figure that out. As far how do you vet it against there's going to be design decisions you're going to have to make during the cloud implementation about, how are you going to put caps on the scalability of your environment? Are you going to let your environment scale to as many users as try to hit it? Or are you going to put some caps on it and say, we don't maybe necessarily have the fiscal ability to, let 1,000 servers run out one day because we got a popular news article on a service. Those are, I think, when you talk about how do you vet those or how do you evaluate those, I don't necessarily see that as a different process for the cloud. It's all about what are your goals, how do you get to them. But Bill, I don't know if you've.
That's great. No, I'm going to just very briefly ask one minute to answer this, because I think it's interesting. What might the policies related to foreign cloud service usage be? For example, Alibaba Cloud. Does anyone have insight on that?
I mean, there's federal guidelines as to where data can be stored, depending on whether or not you're a government agency that's subject to FISMA or not. That's all in law. I won't say more than that. You can look it up.
Cool.
It's pretty clearly defined, at least as far as the executive branch, where we can and cannot store our data.
Yeah, and I've seen this. Strangely enough, I've actually seen more acute version of this at the state level, where I've talked to a couple of state governments where they've actually had issues where they don't want their data stored in another state. So even, the international thing is hard enough, but there have certainly been some state government issues where, this state says all of our data has to be maintained within the borders. It's kind of like I call it a more acute issue just because it's kind of it narrows the geography so much more. But I would say consult the whatever applicable laws.
Regulations. Yeah, totally. Guys, thank you both so much. You made my job very easy today because of all the great back and forth, and I really appreciate the insight you shared. That brings us to the end of our time for this portion of our program, but at this time I'd like to turn the program over to Sean Applegate, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Swish Data, and Glenn Deskin, Head of Engineering for Checkpoint Software Technologies. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Brandy. So Glenn, I'd like to get you to talk about maybe what you think is in scope for cloud and how that impacts our customers in federal.
Sure. Yeah, I think some great conversation, and there were some very interesting points made by both gentlemen here today, and a couple things that stood out to me that I thought might talk about, and I see some questions in the Q&A that would relate to a couple of the points that were made. One of the things that Tom said earlier is, don't think differently with regard to cloud as to your traditional security or data center security. I thought that was a really valid point because I think that's the first thing that's missed. We think differently, and then that, of course, leads to the question of the shared responsibility that was also discussed, and looking out for the defaults. We move our data centers into the cloud, and then we have to then now think about, okay, well, I've moved it, but let's now think about security. So one of the questions that came up was, is there a list of defaults or things that I need to look for? And around that, one of the first things I think that needs to be considered is cloud security posture management tools around that, such as the Checkpoint Cloud Guard suite, which will directly answer that question by providing the ability to look at the security posture and determine if it meets certain standards. I mean, for example, you could put in a specific regulation or requirement and see how your cloud environment stands up to that regulation. So those are some key elements, and there's some tools. I think that's very important. And as Tom pointed out, the same thing that we do for our physical security, we should be looking at in the cloud. And so having the right tools, and especially tools that are multi-cloud, that's a really big thing here too, because I think most agencies, organizations that we've all, I know that I've spoken with, are not just looking at one cloud, whether it be AWS, Azure, or Google, or others. It's usually a combination. It's usually two or more, and that also makes it difficult. So when we're looking at tools and looking at security components, and we need to consider, are we going to keep doing point-based solutions to address each different unique environment, or are we going to have a comprehensive set of tools that address multi-cloud with the same capabilities across all of those platforms? I think that was kind of seemed to be quite a bit of the conversation around that theme there, and I think that's one of the most important things. And as I said, Checkpoint does offer capabilities in that space with regard to that security posture management.
Oh, absolutely. Good.
So
yeah, and you actually mentioned that rationalization. Let's pull that thread a little bit. And so in our case, when we think about application rationalization, often that's re-architecting your application and the processes around those. And if you're moving, for example, from a legacy 3-tier app to a cloud-based app that has 12-factor type architectures, they're elastic and scalable, your security needs to change with that as well. And often when we work with our clients, that's not just you're moving up the stack and looking at cloud and functions as a service and maybe external microservices, like things that are provided, say, within Office 365 as API calls even. But we also need to write new code and secure the code. So, I think it's a great opportunity for customers to look at how do I rationalize my tools And in looking at those next gen integrated tool sets that provide a lot of value, there's opportunities to not just consolidate on the application side and rationalize, but also on the security tool side. And also, that means when you reskill, if you've consolidated your security tools, often we find that you can also then optimize your reskilling effort. So you have to train on fewer things, there's fewer logins, there's less infrastructure to manage. And if you can get that as a SaaS framework, where it's in the cloud, you don't need to do the lower level, bloating a server or VM and managing it and patching it regularly, right? You just trust the SaaS provider that's providing that capability. So things like CloudGuard's a great example of that from Checkpoint, where it can cover SaaS, it can cover cloud, it can cover infrastructure as a service, it can cover both on-prem and off-prem. So there's a lot of value we find in that. So maybe separate of moving up that stack and rationalizing, a lot of what we hear next when we talk next gen is around AI. Can you talk to kind of where AI plays into some of those consolidated frameworks and where the value is there?
Sure. And actually, as you talk about, moving further, our initial shift to the cloud would be, moving to virtual compute instances, right? I think one of the comments was around the cost and, hey, look at the bill, because just moving, a server to the cloud and, for what it is not really the cost savings there. It's then when we take that next step and then we start talking about serverless functions and components there. And, we have the ability, and then how it ties into the AI is being able to analyze those components. Providing security around, compute instances is very similar, as Tom pointed out earlier. Don't think of it differently. It's the same type of perimeter-based security, server-based security, those types of components. But now we have to have additional intelligence to be able to look at serverless functions, Lambda functions. So now that we've taken the next step in virtualization from virtualizing the server itself, now we're going to strip it even further down and just have a function that's going to, be, 3 seconds, 30 seconds a day, whatever the amount of time that this thing lives, and be able to provide security around that. So the AI comes in, to play a key role there in being able to not only provide, traditional, signature-based, behavioral-based type security around the perimeter and the server components themselves or the compute instances. Now we have to start looking at code. We have to start looking at the serverless functions. Is this thing performing a function that shouldn't be allowed? What are the privileges on this? What's the behavior? So AI becomes increasingly more important, and AI is about the amount of data too. So when we talk about a threat intelligence platform, AI, can be a long conversation in itself, but I think at the end of it, it's about the amount of data that you use to determine that. It's kind of analogous to, if I'm going to, train a robot to do surgery, I want that to be trained by the surgeon that's got 25 years of experience and not the new resident. So that level of experience is key in AI. And so when you take a threat intelligence platform or, cloud security posture management system that has that built in, it's important that, the capability of that threat intelligence platform is there as well, because that definitely impacts the effectiveness of the AI. So like I said, when we drill into even further looking at now code and runtime security, it becomes even, more important there.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, I thought the one comment about remote first was amazing, because I've worked for Northern California companies for about 16 years, and I've worked out of a remote office for that whole time. And so I find it very interesting working my time primarily with public sector over 20 plus years in both that OEM kind of tech vendor role, and now it's Swish as a boutique integrator. It's game changing how many government people I've talked to lately that just love being remote. They're like, wow, this is great. It's working. And it was painful for a little while, but now they see the value of it and it's really exciting. But the one pain point we've seen consistently is, well, how do I get the cloud quicker? How do I maybe adopt TIC 3.0 faster? How do I take care of the remote sites maybe that are still operating through a slow MPLS circuit and they want to get them to a high-speed internet circuit quickly? So there's a lot of discussions now around as we move back to being on premise again and maybe a little less remote all the time. How do we not just make performance better, but how do we make sure we change the infrastructure both for how we enable performance or customer experience, but also make sure the security is there lockstep. And often when we do this at Swish, we look at it as two sides of the same coin, right? Performance and security often go lockstep. You need to be able to monitor both with very similar types of monitoring, but slightly different lenses. And so I don't know, Glenn, do you have any maybe touch points around things where you see the intersection of SD-WAN and TIC 3.0 or SASE type architectures?
Yeah, actually, it was an interesting conversation there around that, as you pointed out, and we've seen this exact scenario play out multiple times. We have many customers in the federal and even state and local that all of a sudden their remote access environment was about a couple hundred users, and then overnight it had to be 25,000. And so the first thing that we look at there is just getting it operational, scalability, speed to implementing that, because this COVID pandemic situation hit almost overnight, and all of a sudden we have to scale from supporting only a couple hundred remote users to 25,000. So that I think was problem number one. So to your question, how does SD-WAN play into that? A lot of customers turn to cloud technologies. We've seen the move to cloud driven significantly by the work from home, remote office, initiatives, primarily because one, obvious we're all remote and we need to be able to support remote connectivity. Two, data centers are locked down. Customers can't get into those data centers. We've had entire locations and customers and agencies that had mandates that no employees are coming in. So therefore, normal operational processes can't be accomplished. So we can't do upgrades. We can't do maintenance. Okay, let's move those things to the cloud. SD-WAN technologies plays a key role here in, you talk about SASE, remote user access, and it's one thing to have that as your remote connection point. I just connect into some cloud connection point, and then it has to pass back in across a direct connect back into my environment. I think that was a point that came up earlier in the conversation about VPN connections back in. But now the shifting all those resources into the cloud now because of the performance and the scalability, because now I'm relying on a single direct connection. So even if I have remote access covered by a cloud-based solution, SD-WAN, which we have many solutions in that space ourselves, from our Connect being a virtual firewall capability in the cloud that we can put in front of a specific branch office. But then there's the same thing for users. So we have end user connect to the cloud, and then that in turn will connect you back to wherever it needs to connect to. But I think the end goal here is, as we move those resources to the cloud, then it eliminates that need to have that traverse all the way back into our traditional data center. So overall, the general issue of remote work has, we're seeing definitely that driving even just the move to data, moving our data centers to cloud. So, and the SD-WAN, of course, is a complete part of that.
No, absolutely, Glenn. Well, I think we're basically out of time. We're going to hand it back to Brandy. So thank you, everybody, for being involved today. And if you want to learn more about Swish Data, you can go to swishdata.com. But Brandy, I'll hand it back to you to wrap things up.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean and Glenn, for sharing these insights. It looks like we're right about at the end of our program. So from Government Executive, we'd like to thank Brandy, Bill, and Tom for that excellent discussion. And Sean and Glenn, thank you for sharing your insights today. Really wonderful discussion all around. Of course, thank you to our audience for tuning in. This event today would not be possible without the support of our underwriters, Swish Data, and Checkpoint.